Welcome, Curiosifers, to another episode of Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. And because we have a new Pope, Pope Leo XIV, it feels like it's the right time to do an episode on exorcism. And I thought I knew something about exorcism. Maybe you did too. And then I did the research for this show and found out so many other really interesting things about what an exorcism is, what it's responding to, the different types. And I have three amazing stories to share with you. These are real exorcism stories. I'm not saying that they were really diabolical events. That I leave to you to make an assessment on that. But these are real events in the sense that these exorcisms really did happen to real people who were going through something, and they were done by ministers or priests or sort of exorcist specialists. Perhaps the most disturbing story involves a headless bear turning a woman into a wheel and running her around her house. But I'll save that one for last. First, let's go to the birthplace of the great king of pop, Michael Jackson. And you know what I'm talking about? Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana has a case that happened very recently, 2012. And it's a pretty remarkable case of an exorcism that was performed on a house, essentially, and a blessing that was designed to protect a family from some diabolical forces in the house. This is the story of Latoya Ammons and her three children. It basically started when they moved into this house in Gary, Indiana, and weird stuff started to happen right away, like kind of poltergeisty things, like where lights would be flickering, weird sounds, radio sounds, and then they started hearing steps in the middle of the night. So living at the house here in the beginning is Latoya, her three kids, and their grandmother, Latoya's mother, Rosa. And basically, they go to bed at night, and in the middle of the night, they hear some clomping on stairs. And they can hear essentially like footsteps coming up from the basement and then entering the house, the kitchen area. And when they wake up, they're seeing stuff like pools of water and even footsteps like in the kitchen. They're kind of freaked out, obviously. They start to lock the door. There's a door that comes up from the cellar or the basement to the kitchen, and it has a lock on it, so they lock the door. And then that night, and I guess a couple of nights after, they actually hear banging on the door. So they're completely freaked out. You might be thinking, well, maybe there's somebody hiding in the basement. Maybe there's somebody, like a homeless person living down here or something, you know. But then other weirder things begin to happen. The kids start to act very strange. Like they start doing this thing that you see a lot in, if you study a lot of witch trials like I do, of course, then you see this kind of psychogenic contagion phenomenon where a group of kids, this happened in Salem, will start to swap like weird behaviors and symptoms. Like one will start speaking in tongues and then stop, and the other will start speaking in tongues, and then another one will. And they'll engage in these kind of contortions. And her kids started to actually display some of this behavior. First it was inside the house, and then eventually it started to happen even outside the house, like in the car, on the way to school. Eventually, Latoya started to actually see a shadowy figure in the house. She could never catch it, but she would catch a glimpse of it, and then it would sort of disappear. And it was this looming figure associated with the noises. And the kids claimed to be actually playing with some kind of ghostly child. Like they would play with this ghostly kid in their closet, but then they couldn't identify it or find it anywhere else. And so this stuff was all adding up and scaring the hell out of them. So Latoya brings in an evangelist, some kind of minister who basically performs a blessing on the house. He goes down and essentially builds a little altar in the basement where they think this is sort of ground zero where all of this sort of evil is coming from. So he makes a little altar and then leaves a Bible open on this little altar and then leaves, and it's pretty good. Like things calm down for a few days, and then all of a sudden the sounds begin again at late one night, and the next day when they check down in the basement, the altar has been cast to the corner of the basement and the Bible has been turned over and knocked down, and so it all begins again. Now, all of this comes to a head when Latoya goes into a room and there is a floating Febreze bottle just sort of hovering in the middle of the room. Now, Febreze is just this kind of spray deodorant that you spray on furniture and clothes to make them smell good. And so this Febreze bottle is just floating in the air, and then it sort of it flies across the room and then into her room, and she follows it, and then she sees the shadowy figure again, and then they disappear. And that's it for her. That tears it. She packs up the family and goes to a hotel. Now, the kids are so freaked out, and they're now living in a hotel, they basically stop going to school, and that signals the state. So DCFS gets involved, and they send an investigator there. And when they're investigating the case, one of the kids is with the grandmother, and they're being interviewed by some kind of child services investigator. And as the child is holding on to the grandmother's hand, the child actually starts to walk backwards up the wall and onto the ceiling. And that becomes like the crystallizing moment, and they basically contact a Catholic priest. Now, in Catholicism, there's two kinds of exorcism. This was the bit that I learned and I did not know before. One is called a supplicating exorcism, and this is something that you can do. Just in case you suspect one of your loved ones to be possessed, you can yourself do a supplicating exorcism, which is essentially just praying for the devil to leave them. The other kind of exorcism is called the imperative exorcism, or the major exorcism, and this can only be done by a Catholic priest who has permission from a bishop. So the priest must write a letter petitioning the bishop so that he can then perform the exorcism on whoever needs it. And so this is much more serious. And what we have is a letter that a Catholic priest wrote to his bishop. And this is from the south side of Chicago, where our new pope is from, by the way. And this is a priest named Reverend Maginot. And Reverend Maginot basically writes to the bishop with a kind of summary of this case at LaToya Ammon's house. And that's the documentation that we have. And so I read that documentation, that letter, and that's where I learned most of the facts of this case. First, the priest goes to the house and blesses it using holy water and incense and oils. And also, what I didn't realize was a fairly common thing apparently is they will bless salt and then sprinkle that salt in areas that they consider to be sort of infected by evil. So this priest brings a bunch of this holy salt and spreads it down in the basement. He interviews LaToya and Rosa, the mother, or the grandmother, the kids, and members of the family who have stayed at the house and also report like feeling sick, feeling nauseous, feeling lethargic, and just depressed after staying there. In fact, some of LaToya's family say, like, we're never coming back there. You got to have the family function somewhere else because there's something about your house. Now, all of this makes me think, is this a case of some kind of poisoning in the house? Is there some kind of, terrible mold, behind the wall that's infecting people and causing a kind of mental illness, a kind of acute psychological episodes? And the reason why I'm saying this is because so many witch trial cases seem connected to what we might call sort of toxins in the environment. So a lot of people associate many of the kind of strange behaviors during the Salem witch trials with ergot poisoning, which is spoiled rye, but also things like poisoning from heavy metals, and like lead poisoning or other kinds of toxins that could be in the environment that could be causing sort of neurological episodes. So that's one thing to keep in the back of your mind that might be relevant here. In any case, the priest interviews all of these people and gets a general sense of what's going on, where it's coming from in the basement. And he manages to get the police to come in there. And when the police officer from Gary arrives, he reports that his radio behaves very strangely. Like as soon as he walks up on the house, like his scanner is going crazy, which is very strange. And then it dies like immediately as soon as he enters the house. And that seems very bizarre too. And then the priest gets the idea, well, maybe there was some kind of terrible event here, like a murder that was unsolved, and so maybe that's what's going on in the basement. So he manages to convince the police to start digging in the basement. I mean, they do a kind of study of the history of the house, which is built in the 1920s. Apparently a couple lived there for their whole lives, and then it was owned, I think, by one other or two other owners who never lived there but rented it out. And so that was all they could determine about the history of the house. But the cops start digging in the basement because there's an area where the cement ends and then strangely it's just dirt. And as they're digging there, they start to find weird stuff. They find a fingernail, they find women's underwear, they find a strange, like a heavy metal weight, which is oftentimes used in old windows inside the window well. They find candy bar wrappers and like hair beads. It's not incriminating or scary, but it's weird stuff to find buried down here. And so the priest spreads the holy salt all around here, and he even sort of imagines a kind of scenario where he says, maybe, this is what he says in the report, that he says maybe the couple that first lived here in the 30s had a child who died. And in a kind of moment of desperation, they turned to the occult in order to try to reconnect or conjure the child again. After blessing the basement, the priest basically does the rounds of the whole house again, but the story ends abruptly because LaToya and her family just moved to another home, to rent another home. Now the priest actually goes there and blesses that home before they arrive there and start living in it. And so that's sort of the end of the story. I believe this house was featured in a kind of demonic house TV show at some point, maybe 10 years ago or something, and has since been demolished. And what I'd love to know, and maybe some of you have done research and know more about this story, is what has happened subsequently? Like, is there any more history on LaToya Ammons or her children? Did they stop having these symptoms? Did somehow this strange behavior and sensibility follow them to another house? I don't know any of that, but would love to know more. So if you know more about it, please put it in the comments. All right, now the other story I want to tell you goes to the Philippines. And this is also a fascinating story. And it has lots of elements of exorcism that sort of came to be part of the exorcism culture, the kind of stuff you see in movies like The Exorcist. And this is a 1950s case in the Philippines of a young woman who is possessed and just harassed by something she calls the Thing. This is the story of Clarita Villanueva. And most of what we know about this story comes from 3 documents. I think 2 of them are actually from eyewitnesses, and one of them is sort of a report based on those stories. And I think there's been stuff in the Philippines on this, but not a lot in the US. Clarita was Catholic, and it looks like she had a rough childhood. Her parents died when she was young, and her brothers, I think, were abusive towards her. So when she turns 18, she moves to Manila and basically starts to work jobs, and she gets picked up for vagrancy, and then she's accused of prostitution. And she ends up in a prison, and it's inside the prison where she begins to have these strange experiences. At first, she's just in her cell. She starts to get like pebbles thrown at her from somewhere. And then they start to turn into larger rocks, and everyone's looking, what the hell's going on? And they can't figure out the origin of this. So that's sort of how it begins. But then quickly it gets really strange. Something comes at her, and it's not one thing, it's actually 2 things. She calls it the Thing, but it's one huge creature and one smaller creature. And she describes them as being like basically shadowy and hairy and incredibly ugly creatures. And she's visited by them. She's just screaming and cannot be consoled, and they have to kind of restrain her. And then bite marks start to appear all over her. And she's claiming that the Thing is coming and basically biting her. So this is an interesting thing about exorcism, which I didn't really realize. I had thought that all exorcisms were, in fact, cases of possession where the devil gets inside you and the priest has to order the devil out. And that certainly happens many, many times. That's probably the predominant case. However, oftentimes it's just people who are really troubled by something they don't understand, and they are in a deep crisis, a spiritual crisis of some kind, and the diabolic elements could be surrounding them or attacking them. This goes all the way back to Saint Anthony in the desert. You'll see this kind of stuff frequently. in the ancient church too. But this is sort of what's happening to Clarita, and it keeps getting worse and worse. So the warden actually investigates the case and also sees these bite marks all over her, and they start to bring in investigators and try to figure out what's going on here. These investigators are primarily psychologists. Is she, in fact, just biting herself, or someone else attacking her, and Clarita thinks it's the devil or that it's a metaphysical presence of some kind? So they start to look into it. A member of the medical staff from the Manila Police Department and an Army medical officer investigate and inspect her. And at first they say, well, this is a kind of hysterical fugue state of some kind. So they're skeptical. Whenever you read these accounts, whether they go back to the medieval period or even most recently, in this case, like in the 50s and even in 2012, you'll see that there's a kind of archetypal storytelling that happens. This one in 1950s is really classic, and you'll see why here in a moment. What happens usually is you have some very mysterious and disturbing event described, then the skeptics come in and doubt it, and then basically the skeptics have more direct experience with the event, and they abandon their skepticism and believe in it, and then there's some kind of religious or spiritual exorcism that finally puts it all to rest. And so that archetypal story narrative arc is classic, and it's definitely in play in this case too. What seems to change the mind of the skeptics is that while they're inspecting her, they actually claim that the bite marks start to appear as she's screaming in front of them. Now that would convert me if I actually saw that happen. I don't know whether that's legit or not, but at one point one of the descriptions says that one of the deputies is holding her by the arm, and so his hand is over her arm, and she starts screaming, and when he takes his hand away, there's a fresh bite mark there, complete with some kind of saliva. This basically leads the skeptics to abandon their doubts and become true believers in the demonic possession. I don't know what to make of this. I suppose if I was a good magician, and maybe some of you out there are good magicians, you know some way this can be faked. There's also some creepy, weird details here too. Like one of the reports is that when they studied the bite marks, they appeared to be round rather than like a human mouth, sort of bivalve human mouth. These were sort of more round, and they were made entirely of molars. Now, I don't know why that really creeps me out. And this is kind of a reversal of the story I just told you, where first the evangelical tries to sacralize the house and bless it and fix the problem, but he's ineffectual, and so the Catholic has to come in and fix it. So it's a kind of pro-Catholic exorcism story. This is the reverse, in a way. Here, the Philippines are largely Catholic, and instead, a evangelical Protestant swoops in and performs the exorcism, and in a way, he puts Protestant evangelical religion on the map in Philippines in a way that it hadn't been before. Evangelism gets kind of inroads into the culture in the 1950s through this kind of an event. And in fact, the main source of report on this is from the evangelical minister himself, a guy named Lester Sumrall. And Lester basically reads about the case in a newspaper article, and he goes to Manila and basically begins a kind of intense prayer methodology where he's holding her and praying over her, and there's other people, sort of witnesses, in the cell with them. And she starts to have these flashes of hysteria, and then she calms down, and then hysteria, and she calms down. At one point, she goes into a catatonic state where she basically just seems to be dead, even though she's breathing. He slaps her around, so this is kind of intense, and she kind of comes out of it. And then here I'll quote from one of the witnesses, quote, "After about an hour, Clarita's face seemed to soften. She became more attentive to the minister before her. In reply to a question, she told him that she liked Jesus Christ. At this state, the minister recited the Lord's Prayer, and Clarita followed him. Then the minister asked if Clarita was still afraid of the thing, and she replied in the negative. She indicated that the thing went out the window, and then 3 ministers sang a joyous hallelujah. Clarita appeared worn out, and she slowly stretched herself on her wooden bed to sleep." Now that ends the formal sort of account of Clarita, but when you look into her actual history her personal history, you do see some interesting patterns here where I think psychologists would point to trauma as some underlying cause. Now, this doesn't rule out a theological explanation because maybe being traumatized opened her up to spiritual influences. But what happened to her is kind of sad. She basically loses her parents early. Her brothers appear to be monsters. She escapes them, and then she starts working where she's also treated like dirt, falls in love with a man who she wants to marry and have a child with, and then he turns out to be married and have 4 other kids. So by the time she's 18, she's had a lot of crisis and trauma, and one wonders if she's just had a kind of psychological break and that the biting might actually be a kind of self-harm. But I think this is something that a psychologist would sort of key in on. All right, now, how about a headless bear? My favorite exorcism story comes from the 1500s. It's a British wonder tale, and it is also claims to be true because there's a sort of eyewitness accounts. And this is where the kind of story I was telling you about, the kind of archetypal story, gets a kind of really clear expression too, because the more actual witnesses you can claim in your pamphlet or your document in the wonder story, the more credibility you've gotten. And if they're skeptics at first, but then they come over to believe in it, it also sort of lends credibility. So this is an amazing story in which some of the tropes that you see, even in the movie The Exorcist, sort of first appear. There's stuff like the bed is basically shaking and levitating. The poor woman who is afflicted is foaming at the mouth. But there's elements here that I've never seen anywhere and that strike me as particularly creepy and also kind of funny. Apparently people in sort of Renaissance and early modern Europe, and particularly in England, had a kind of fear of headless bears. And so there's reference to headless bears in Shakespeare, I think in Marlowe, as a kind of warning for you to get your life straight and become virtuous, because without that, demonic headless bears are in your future. So this begins with a domestic scene of a husband and wife, and the wife basically starts to have visions. The husband is completely desperate to help her, but he doesn't know how. She starts to see the devil in the room with her, and she's saying things like, "Don't you see the devil? He's right there at the edge of the bed." And of course, there's nothing there, but she's kind of hallucinating, and it gets really intense. She becomes feverish. She begins vomiting. She's getting up in the middle of the night and wandering the house. She begins to see other sort of spectral visions. And the husband is basically praying over her and then bringing priests to come and pray over her and trying to contain her as much as he can and just calm her down. And it comes to a crescendo when she claims it's here. And he looks to the edge of the bed, and there is suddenly a giant headless bear creature of some kind, which is thrashing around in the room. He grabs a chair and smashes it over this thing, and then it picks her up and forms her into a wheel, a hoop of some kind. And then he begins to roll her around the room, and then out of the room and down the hall and down the stairs. So there's a headless bear rolling a woman like a hoop all through the house, like going, and the husband is there freaking out. There's other witnesses there, and they can't believe what they're seeing, and she's screaming, and they're like paralyzed with fear and don't know what to do, and then they start attacking it, and then eventually it rolls her back up into the bed. Finally, this bear disappears, but she shoots across the room, and she actually, her legs go out the window, but you know how windows have like a central bar in them? She stopped from going all the way out because basically she hits that with her body while her legs are outside the window, and then her feet are on fire and she's screaming, and the husband and his brother sort of run to her and they lay their hands on her and start saying the Lord's Prayer, and then a small child appears out the window and down the street, and it's this strange like luminescent child who then floats up to her. And it basically appears to be the Christ child. And then she stops feeling pain. The fire goes away on her legs. They draw her back into the room and into the bed. And basically, this child is sort of hovering outside the window, and she calms down. And this is basically how she's cured of the illness. It looks like there's a divine intervention that comes down and exorcises the devil directly out of her. And that's how the story ends. But it doesn't quite end there, because it's usually followed by a kind of morality. The moral of the story is she finally realizes that it was her immorality that led all this to befall her. And so these are all cautionary stories, all cautionary tales that are within the sort of realm of traditional mainstream religion, designed to keep you on the path of virtue. And that's really one of the key elements of exorcism stories. Okay, those are 3 purportedly real exorcisms. I had not heard of any of them, and I find them fascinating. I hope you did too. And if you like this kind of thing, remember to subscribe, check out our Patreon page, and keep coming back here for weekly episodes of Professor Asma's Guide to Unusual Knowledge. See you next time, Curiosifers.